Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan Torrey. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our special event tonight, Hinge Points, Inside North Korea with Dr. Siegfried Hecker and Jim Falk. Tonight's special program is in conjunction with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, Global Santa Fe, the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville, and World Affairs San Francisco, who are recording it for their show On Shifting Ground with Ray Suarez. One of the wonderful things about World Affairs Councils is that we exist in communities around the country. And in fact, many of our members are around the world. So I want to welcome all of our audience here tonight, joining us from places like Texas and California, Massachusetts, South Carolina, New Mexico, Michigan, Switzerland, Hawaii, and China. Welcome, everybody. It is absolutely my honor and my privilege to introduce my esteemed colleague and my friend, Jim Falk. Jim is President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. He retired in March of 2021 after serving as the council's president for more than 2 decades. Now residing in Santa Fe, New Mexico, he is a member of the board of Global Santa Fe, where he chairs their program initiatives. Jim co-hosts the public affairs program Perspectives Matter on Dallas public television station, KERA. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an honorary consul of Morocco for the states of New Mexico and Texas. When Jim is not prepping for interviews, you'll find him hiking with his Vizsla and hero dog. Those are my words, Maddie, and happily hiking in the mountains around Santa Fe. Jim, take it away, my friend.
Thank you so much, Megan. What an introduction. Well, good evening, everyone. And it's great to have so many people from across the globe tuning in. And I think you'll be very, very interested in what Dr. Hecker has to say. This is my second conversation with him, and it is indeed an honor. There are not many people in Santa Fe who do not know Dr. Hecker. So we ask, how did one of the poorest, most isolated countries, often described as the Hermit Kingdom, manage in over less than 30 years from having essentially no nuclear weapons to having, some think, over 50 bombs and becoming potentially a major threat to the United States? In fact, the Carnegie Endowment senior fellow, Ankit Panda, says this: North Korea is a third nuclear deterrence relationship for the United States, of course, then including China and Russia. Already this year, North Korea has fired more than 20 ballistic and cruise missiles. Actions taken, according to President Kim Jongun, in response to the United States and South Korea's joint military exercise, codenamed Freedom Shield. If the current trend holds, North Korea is expected to hit a new record of missile tests. And while the People's Republic of Korea has not conducted a nuclear test since 2017, it seems possible, increasingly likely, that this may be the year for another. So as I mentioned, we are extremely fortunate to have with us one of the nation's foremost experts on Korea's nuclear capability, as well as nuclear weapons throughout the world. Dr. Siegfried Hecker is Director Emeritus of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He joined the lab first as a graduate research assistant in 1965, and since then, as you can imagine, he held many positions, including serving as its director from 1986 to 1997. He's also the Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, having been a professor in the Department of Management Science and Engineering. And today he's the Professor of Practice in the Nuclear Engineering Department at Texas A&M University in College Station, as well as the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Now, the book Hinge Points is his second book following Doomed to Cooperate, which was published in 2016, which focused on post-Soviet Russia and American nuclear cooperation. Hard to believe that now, isn't it? He earned all of his academic degrees, bachelor's, master's, and his doctoral degree at Case Western Reserve University. And over his remarkable career, he has received numerous awards. The highlight include the Eugene Grant Undergraduate Teaching Award at Stanford and the Presidential Enrico Fermi Award. And he is a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And what I found somewhat surprising, especially now, he's a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Neighbor, Dr. Hecker, great to have you with us today.
It's my great pleasure, Jim.
So, your first visit to North Korea happened in 2004. And I just find it really quite amazing that you were able to go there. And as you write in the book, it really was part of not track 2 diplomacy, which I think many people in this audience will know, but track 1.5. How did you end up there? And what is track 1.5 diplomacy?
Jim, I didn't want to go to North Korea. Track 1 or track 2, I'd hoped to never have to be in North Korea. However, my good colleague from Stanford, John Lewis, invited me to come along. And the essence of track 1.5 or 2 is that it's non-official, non-governmental. So it's a way for academics or others to actually provide a bridge, sort of a link to another side that we often don't talk to. So John had a relation, having been in North Korea several times before 2004. The North Koreans actually contacted John and said, look, we're going to take you to a nuclear center the next time. And that's when John called up. And I said, John, I don't want to go to North Korea. I've been in Russia, I've been in China, I've been all these other places. However, he was persistent and I wound up in North Korea.
So many World Affairs Councils are involved with the International Visitor Leader Program, that important exchange program conducted by the State Department. And you're a big believer in science diplomacy. And I've learned recently that even before your visits to North Korea, you made several visits to China and Russia. Is that something that happened frequently? And did we also reciprocate and have high-level visitors such as yourself visit some of our nuclear facilities in the United States?
Well, for the case of Russia, without question, the Russia exchanges between and it wasn't just scientists, it was nuclear weapons scientists like myself when I was at Los Alamos at that time. So we actually were able to go to the Russian Los Alamos, their nuclear weapons laboratories, and they came across to our laboratories. So we had them in the laboratories. In fact, it wasn't just exchanging and talking. We actually did scientific experiments together because we had very similar interest to be able to get to sort of areas of science that are difficult to get to, that we both had interests in. And so we did experiments together. And then eventually, we also did a lot of work together as to how you protect nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, et cetera. We did something similar with China, although much less so. It turns out China has always been sort of more sensitive issue for the United States, but nevertheless, we had exchanges. We had Chinese at Los Alamos. I was in the Chinese nuclear weapons complex. So these indeed are great opportunities for the scientists, and in this case, the nuclear scientists, to be able to actually understand what the other side is like.
So when you first went in 2004, which was essentially a private visit, what was the reaction of, say, the Department of State or our intelligence agencies here? Were they supportive of it, and did they immediately want to debrief you?
So it was very interesting. First, the getting there was interesting. At that time, in 2004, I was still at Los Alamos National Laboratory, but not a government employee, because the laboratory was run by the University of California. So it was still non-governmental, non-official. But of course, I had to get approval from the US government to go. And so before I went, in essence, this was during the time of the Bush administration. The people in the National Security Council and in a couple of, including the CIA, I was not allowed to be briefed by those people. Nevertheless, in the Department of Energy, and one person in the Department of State at very high level thought, why not? Why not let Hecker go? He might learn something, because 2004 was a particular difficult time in relationship with North Korea, in that they had withdrawn from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so they said we could find out something. When I came back, then the situation was totally different. I essentially briefed everyone in the government, and then I was more welcome. Some folks, of the hardliners, were still skeptical.
So when you left North Korea on your first trip in 2004, you flew back, if I'm correct, through Beijing. Is that right?
So that's correct. I mean, the only way we could get into North Korea is Beijing, and then there's Air Koryo, the North Korean airline, into Pyongyang. And that's the way we flew in through Beijing into Pyongyang. The same on the way out. We went from Pyongyang back out to Beijing. And since I had had relationships with the Chinese nuclear complex, they invited me first to one of their seminars. It was actually an international seminar. I attended that seminar. They, of course, were all interested in what did you find in North Korea. I said, no, wait a minute. I gotta. They treated me very nicely. I got out, but I got to report back to our government first, which I did. And so, yes, I actually stopped in China. And essentially, I've been in China and have met with Chinese, both the diplomats as well as the technical people, on every visit that I made to North Korea. And I made 7 altogether.
Well, I can imagine that they were eager to pick your brain. Why do you think at that time in 2004, and then even subsequently, that the North Koreans were so open and wanting to show you what they did? And we'll get to that in a minute.
So they were open, and that's one of the things that really prompted me to write the book. So I was in North Korea 7 times, and what I learned, the discussions, what I tried to do in the book is actually bring the reader inside of North Korea. To have them, to share with them what my experience was. And so in that my first visit to North Korea in 2004, they were incredibly forthcoming. They were very, very open. Why so? And then they showed me so much. As I describe in the book, I actually wound up touring through their nuclear facilities, holding their plutonium in my hand. Now, for all of those of you who might sort of move back a bit, it was in a glass jar, it was sealed, and if you have plutonium in a glass jar sealed, it's not going to hurt you. So they actually showed me that much. And the reason for that, Jim, at least, what I surmised, was that in late 2002, the Bush administration confronted the North Koreans, and that confrontation essentially killed the deal that the Clinton administration had made, which froze the North Korean nuclear plutonium complex from 1994 to 2002. And so at that point, the North Koreans then, to get back at the Bush administration and the Americans, they expelled the international inspectors. They withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and said, we're going to build the bomb. So this was now in early 2003. We move into late 2003, and nothing happened. And quite frankly, I think the North Koreans were just ticked off. They said, hey, look, we go ahead. We go move in the direction of building a bomb, and nobody seems to care. So they invited John Lewis. They didn't know of me at the time. They invited John Lewis to come and show him some things. And I figured when John tells them I'm going to bring Hecker along, there's no way the North Koreans are going to approve that. Well, it turns out for them, that was the coup de grace. They're not only going to show enough that we conclude they have the bomb, but they show it to a former director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So they specifically, what they wanted from my visit was to show me enough, no BS. I mean, they really showed me a lot. And then have me conclude, boy, if I can see that piece of plutonium, if they can make that piece of plutonium, they can make the bomb. And in the end, that was the bottom line.
So your access on your first visit in 2004 was quite a lot. Did that change over the period of the 6 future visits?
So it was very interesting. For the most part, the sort of the straightforward relationship I had with the North Korean nuclear program stayed constant, essentially all the way through. However, when I went back in 2005, when I went back in 2006, they said, okay, we cannot take you to the nuclear center this time. In 2005, they said, we're actually reprocessing plutonium from one of their reactor runs. And they said, so it's not safe for you to go there now. However, the director met with me in Pyongyang, and I got an update as to what was going on. In 2006, when I was there, it was just weeks after the first nuclear test, when they were finally going to show the Bush administration, look, you're not paying any attention, you're not working with us, you're not willing to listen with us about our desire to actually normalize relations with the United States. We're going to show you. So they did a nuclear test. So we were there. They also said, we can't go there now. 2007, 2008, those were very, very good visits. Again, I got access to lots. 2009, this was just after President Obama went into office. And that was very different. They basically told us, look, you don't know how bad things are going to get. They essentially told us they're going to walk away. Then in 2010 is when they actually showed us the second path to the bomb, the uranium enrichment centrifuge facility. And that wasn't anywhere near as wide open as the first couple of visits. But nevertheless, we still had very, very fruitful, very important discussion. So they invited me back.
So, a key part of your book is explaining that North Korea really did have a strategy, and it was a dual track strategy of diplomacy and nuclear weapons. Elaborate on that, would you? Because I think that's something that we really don't understand or appreciate.
Yeah, that's certainly, that's my sense. I also didn't understand that fully at the time I was going there. And the last visit was the 2010 visit. However, what I was able to do, again, I'm a technical guy, so I went there to work with the technical people. My colleagues are the ones that understood the policy and the diplomacy aspect of all of this. And so what I finally figured out, and then of course I followed North Korea ever since the last visit in 2010, then it took me some time to figure out that when I bring together sort of the interplay of the technical world and the diplomatic world, that's what then convinced me that what North Korea has done essentially since 1990, when Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, was in power, he actually had made the decision that with the end of the Cold War, with Russia going different directions, China linking up with South Korea economically, that it might be just better to seek accommodation or normalization with the Americans. And so my view then, Kim Il-sung was interested in normalization and diplomacy to get there. However, because of the nature of North Korea, by that time, their military was, nowhere close to what South Korea had, certainly nowhere close to what the United States had. And their economy was in the dumps. And so they couldn't trust themselves to the outside forces. They had to try to do it and do this diplomacy from a position of strength. And that's, in essence, when they said, look, we have to develop nuclear weapons. Our conventional can't compete. And that's where then this strategy of dual track is try diplomacy, see if you can reach normalization with the Americans, but at the same time, make sure you also develop the nuclear capabilities in case that doesn't work out. And what I do in the book is I track those two through three American administrations, and that is George W. Bush, then Obama, and Trump administration.
And why don't you right now, this would be a good point to explain what you mean by hinge points. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go through all of them that you identify and discuss in such detail, but let's start with, and you've touched on it, what happened in 2002 with the George W. Bush administration, which you call, I believe, a fateful hinge point.
Yeah, it actually, Jim, it was a disaster. That's what it was, because at that time they didn't have nuclear weapons yet. They had the bits and pieces, but most of the important parts were frozen. So hinge points, the way that the hinge points developed is because North Korea always kept that second option, that is the nuclearization, building the capabilities for nuclear weapons open. That came to points where in that time, in 2002, the Americans discovered, and actually it was already known in the Clinton administration, but latest information came up that North Korea, while they were freezing plutonium path to the bomb, were exploring and developing the uranium path to the bomb. So that then was a very key decision point. So what do you do about that? Well, that's a hinge point. What the Bush administration did is they walked away from the plutonium deal also. And that was a very bad trade-off, because in the uranium, and again, I explain in the book exactly the best as we know what North Korea was actually doing in uranium enrichment. They were definitely pursuing uranium enrichment, but it would take them another 10 years or so to get to where they can build a bomb. Whereas in the plutonium, it was well known that they had what we call spent fuel, used reactor fuel, in a cooling pool that could be taken out and reprocessed in a matter of months and then build the bomb in less than a year. So that I call a hinge point, and they made a bad decision to go ahead and walk away from the deal. So then, I can just, quickly, if you like, go through just an example in the Obama and then Trump eventually.
Well, let's do that in just a second, because one of the things that I found surprising is, as I said in our open, North Korea has been described as the Hermit Kingdom. And when you, at least my understanding is that it's such a poor country, we know about starvation and so forth. I don't imagine them having great universities. How were they able to develop technologically so much that they've been able to do? And as you respond to that, also bring in what relationship they've had with Pakistan and, of course, the infamous Khan.
Yeah, so in the book, again, I sort of track, as best as we can. A lot of people believe, because of what you just said, North Korea being a small, poor country, they couldn't have possibly done this themselves. Someone helped them. Well, it turns out, from my standpoint, no one helped them directly to build the bomb. And so they're actually much better than what we would give them credit for. Their university systems are better. They're very smart. Now, they did, of course, have some help. The initial help came from the Soviet version of Atoms for Peace. President Eisenhower, actually this year, this December, is going to be the 70th anniversary of Atoms for Peace. So that program was, we're going to help you other countries that don't have the bomb and forswear the bomb. In other words, it won't go there. We're going to help you doing peaceful nuclear energy. And North Korea took advantage of that from Moscow. Iran took advantage of that from the United States. So that gave them at least an initial start. They sent people to Moscow, sent to school, and then the Soviets actually built the first little research reactor. You don't build a bomb with that, but you learn how to do research. You learn how to take steps towards nuclear electricity. But it certainly helped them. But then the North Koreans, by about 1980 timeframe, decided they're going to go ahead and get much more serious, not just this peaceful stuff, but actually to do the things they need to do to build the bomb if they decide to do so. Then in that process, from 1980s, up into the time frame that we're talking about, the North Koreans were just both very good engineers, not necessarily world scientists the way that the Soviets and the Russians were, but very, very good engineers. And then they were so clever of being able to pick things out of the international literature and also to take advantage of what I call the European black market in nuclear things. And one of those guys who took advantage of the European black market was A.Q. Khan. He was the notorious Pakistani scientist. And yes, they did then in the 90s link up with Pakistan and with A.Q. Khan. He helped them along their way towards the centrifuges, but A.Q. Khan was not the reason that North Korea developed the nuclear bomb. They already had their own path in the plutonium direction. They learned a lot. They reverse engineered a lot of what was done in Europe. And then along the way, they've just continued to improve both their nuclear capabilities and their missile capabilities.
So at that point, China, the United States always seems to take the position that China can exert a great deal of influence on North Korea in a variety of ways. And have you found in your visits as well as follow-up research and communication that is the case or not?
So from my discussions with the Chinese, from my discussions with the North Koreans, China did not help North Korea build the bomb. Russia, Soviet Union did not help North Korea to build the bomb. In both cases, there were exchanges in the missile arena where the North Koreans certainly benefited, from the capabilities that they were able to get from China, but North Korea did not get the bomb because of the Chinese.
So to give us a better sense now of the leadership, of course, Kim Jongun has been satired years ago in that Sony Pictures movie, I believe it was called The Interview, which did not work to their advantage because it's alleged and I guess proven that North Korea then hacked into Sony's computers and caused a great deal of damage. But have we underestimated, perhaps not so much today, but certainly in the past, Kim Jongun?
Oh, I think so, absolutely. Well, first, the most important thing is we didn't know him. We didn't know much about Kim Jongun, and we knew almost nothing about his military. And so actually one of the benefits we got from Trump's reaching out to Kim Jongun, which happened at the very end of 2017 and then wound up with the Singapore summit, is in that summit, we learned more about Kim Jongun than we had known, since he came to power in December of 2011. But yeah, we didn't really understand Kim Jongun, and effectively, I mean, he's been able to build up, a remarkable capability and quite frankly, a dangerous capability in combining the nuclear devices and the missile capabilities.
You and I first did a book talk about 6 weeks ago here in Santa Fe, and it was shortly after there was a great deal of publicity about his 9 or 10 or 11-year-old daughter. But she's continued to be put in the forefront, which seems really quite astonishing.
But when you asked me that, some time ago, I said, look, I don't want to go there. I don't want to
I remember.
Guess as to, is she really going to be important? Is she going to be the heir? Well, it turns out, as you just mentioned, ever since, I mean, she's appeared, in photos and at places that you just would never expect to see a 10-year-old young lady. And so it's become much more serious, I think. It really does look like Kim Jong-un is sort of putting her up there as showing her as that she's going to be the next heir, and the Kim family will keep going. But in the end, I mean, we really don't know. It's peculiar, but it's being done.
Let me encourage those who are watching and participating in tonight's program to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, because I will bring them into our conversation. Dr. Hecker, talk about the Obama administration.
So the Obama administration took a very different tack, with North Korea, with Iran, as you well know, very different from George W. Bush. But in the end, it wound up in the same place, and that is North Korea developed more and more bombs, more and more missiles during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And so I point out several hinge points also in the Obama administration. One came very early. President Obama came into office in early 2009, and the North Koreans decided to greet him with what they called a satellite launch. And in fact, it was done essentially right before President Obama's famous Prague speech, in April 5th of 2009. Well, to President Obama, that seemed to really turn him off and put him in the same mold that you can't trust these North Koreans, provocations, they try to extract the benefits. And so they are not really interested in diplomacy or normalization. There was one more chance in 2012 with something called the Leap Day deal. And again, whereas President Obama and his people thought they actually had a deal with the North Koreans, this was now with Kim Jongun in power of 2012, is again, they launched a satellite. And so that really finished up North Korea as far as the Obama administration is concerned, and they never got any closer. And so during the Obama administration, then the North Koreans were riding of this dual track. They were riding the nuclearization. They tried diplomacy a couple of times, it didn't work. And so then that got us into the Trump administration. And in the end, I just saw one of the headlines of one of the reviews of my book saying, failed US policies towards North Korea were a bipartisan affair. And that's indeed, the hinge points demonstrate that.
So when President Trump initiated the first summit meeting, were you, Dr. Hecker, feeling optimistic? Did you think it was a good idea? And from the conversations you had with people across the world, was there some degree of optimism at that first summit?
Yeah, there certainly was in my camp. And in fact, I had published just before that summit with my Stanford colleagues a long narrative about where we could go from here. And it was really my hope that Trump or someone in the Trump administration would walk in that direction. And that narrative essentially laid out an approach that said what we need North Koreans to do is to halt, roll back, and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons on the Korea Peninsula. And I said, that's going to take 10 or so years. My colleagues Bill Broad and David Sanger in New York Times had a big headline that said, Hecker says it's going to take 15 years, because when Bill Broad asked me, you sure they can do it in 10 years? I said, no, I'm not sure they can do it in 10 years. Maybe it'll take 15 years. So we'd actually laid out the potential expectations. And so I had some hopes. And indeed, in my opinion, Trump walked away from that summit in exactly the right mode. There wasn't much detail. He was criticized for that. But in the very short joint statement, they had the two key things. North Koreans said they wanted normalization. That was in the statement. Trump said we wanted denuclearization. That was in the statement. So that was very, very positive. The problem then was, how do you get from there to the next summit in Hanoi? And there, both the Americans and the North Koreans just made major mistakes. North Korean mistake was they never allowed their people to work closely with Steve Biegun, who was our envoy for these talks, who's a superb diplomat. They waited for the final get-together of Trump and Kim Jongun in Hanoi. The American mistake was that, quite frankly, John Bolton was back in the government and National Security Council, and he had prepped Trump very well to make sure that no deal would be made, and then he was better walking away. And the peculiar thing is, when Trump walked away, he was congratulated by both sides of the political spectrum, better no deal than a bad deal. I wrote a piece shortly thereafter, and I said, really? I don't think so. And we're paying the price for that today.
Well, that's an important point, is that there really was division within the US government, and that John Bolton had an extraordinary access, and from day one was adamantly opposed to any normalization of relations with North Korea.
Oh, that's correct, and he's proud of it. I mean, in his book, Surrender is Not an Option, he talked about essentially that first hinge point, and then in the next book, The Room Where It Happened, he talked about the Trump and Hanoi hinge point. I guess what I have to say is, let's look at the result in the spirit of your introduction, where you mentioned Ankit Panda, is we are at the point today where North Korea is only one of 3 countries in the world that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons, the other 2 being Russia and China. I mean, for heaven's sakes, how did we get there? That's what I try to cover in the book.
So it won't surprise you that one of our questions is, what is the best approach for the United States now vis-a-vis North Korea? And I would add to that, what are we doing? So
today, we are in a totally different world. So this dual track diplomacy, the interest in diplomacy, that was there for 30 years. Each one of the Kims I try to demonstrate had an interest at some time in normalization with the United States. I'm afraid today, as we sit here in 2023, that we've had a phase change, a pattern change, and that is that Kim Jongun and North Korea today is no longer interested in that accommodation with the United States. They've decided instead to switch back to Russia and to China. And, I've worked with the Biden administration, and they show their frustration by essentially saying they won't answer the phone. We're willing to talk to them, and they're not willing to talk. So now it's going to take a complete rethink as to how we get back to actually dealing with North Korea.
So when we read in the paper, and it's almost every day, about their missile tests, how do you view it? Do they have the capacity to reach the United States? And if not, when do you forecast that they might be able to? And how strong is our defense?
So the important part today is that, in my opinion, they can reach all of South Korea and most of Japan with a nuclear-tipped missile. They've done enough nuclear tests, they've done enough missile tests that we have to believe that they can do that. And for example, many of the tests you've seen in the last couple of weeks are much more like operational tests rather than research and development tests. So they're definitely moving in that direction. They have that capability. We don't know exactly, how much bomb fuel, the plutonium and uranium they have, but it's enough for perhaps 40 to 60 bombs. That's one heck of a lot. And this is what they can do as far as reaching South Korea and Japan. It's my opinion they do not yet have the ability to reach the United States with any certainty on their part. In other words, they can't be confident. They've never straightened out any of their ICBM tests so they can go as far as the United States. They've demonstrated they have the horsepower to be able to reach. They've shown in nuclear tests, they've probably tested a hydrogen bomb, with a yield over 200 kilotons, which is 10 times that of Nagasaki. So it's serious business. But to mate those two together, in my opinion, is going to take more. When will they get there? I don't know. The problem is they've walked consistently in that direction. They're much farther today than we would have expected them to be 10 years ago. So unless somehow we can get back, first of all, make sure we protect our assets and our allies, but then also to get back to talk with North Korea and see whether there isn't a different way forward.
So we have a very interesting question from Michael, and he asks, are there lessons that we could take from our negotiations and situation with North Korea that might be applicable to what's happening with Ukraine and Russia's threats to perhaps use tactical nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think most of the lessons kind of go in the other direction from what's happening in Ukraine, is because Putin has essentially, he's trashed. So all of sort of the nuclear norms, that have developed over the years. And so he's made it a much more dangerous place as to what countries with nuclear weapons could do. And the North Koreans have to be watching this. For example, and they are, for example, Putin some years ago had gone out and said, hey, look, we've now developed this super weapon, a nuclear underwater, what they call the Poseidon, and that would blow up in New York Harbor. Well, lo and behold, just in this past week, the North Koreans said, hey, we've developed one of those also. And so that feeds on each other. And what Ukraine shows is that, for heaven's sakes, if you have, a country in such turmoil and you actually have the difficulties between countries, that there is this potential to go nuclear.
Well, this perhaps is too simplistic of a question, but if the United States and others accepted and recognized North Korea as a nuclear power, would that perhaps lessen the tension?
Yeah, so in my opinion, no. We should definitely not recognize them as a nuclear power. We do have the difficult situation of what was done with India and with Pakistan.
Exactly.
We never recognized them as the formal nuclear power. They're still out of the non-proliferation treaty, and recognizing a nuclear North Korea is not the path to go. The path to go is to work with them, is to get towards the denuclearization. It's just that today that's extremely difficult. We've had many opportunities in the past, and we managed to not take advantage of these opportunities, but recognize them as a nuclear power. I mean, if you just look at then the region of South Korea, Japan, those countries certainly have the capability to go nuclear, and that would make the region that much more dangerous. And so I do not see our country wanting to go in that direction.
Well, that's a perfect segue to an article that you wrote a few weeks ago. I think it was in January, when the president of South Korea suggested, or put up a trial balloon, whatever you want to call it, that South Korea could consider developing its own nuclear weapons, or would ask the United States to redeploy its. Go ahead and give us your thoughts on that. And I think they've changed somewhat since we last talked. And I think we should also point out that essentially 2/3 or more of the polls in South Korea show that the citizens of South Korea are in support, are in favor of South Korea having nuclear weapons or nuclear capability.
Right. The public polls have shown over 70% of the South Korean public being in favor of them developing their own nuclear weapons. From my standpoint, it's a terrible, terrible idea to have South Korea go in that direction. We have a very good functional alliance with South Korea. They're essentially, under our nuclear umbrella, as is Japan. And getting out of that umbrella would, in my opinion, first of all, because of the issues of the non-proliferation treaty, of then South Korea, there will have to be consequences from the United States, from other states across the country. That, I think, would devastate their economy. It would also make them less safe, because the North Koreans are far ahead of the South Koreans. And right now, the South Koreans rely on our nuclear umbrella. So, and then from a nuclear civilian standpoint, the South Koreans have agreements with the Americans, in terms of reactor-related technologies. They become one of the best in the world, and they supply, a significant fraction, in the 30+%, of South Korean electricity. All of that is going to be endangered if South Korea decides to follow its own path to nuclear weapons. It's definitely not the way to go.
Along the same line of questions about the expansion of nuclear weapons in different countries, one of our guests asked about Iran. Is now that we have clearly withdrawn, of course, we withdrew from the JCPOA and the negotiations are definitely at an abrupt end. What might we do right now with Iran?
I guess, first of all, the people within sort of the golden picture and so forth in the American region. So you don't want to have these other countries go out and develop their own nuclear weapons. It just makes it so complex. And so you would much rather, sort of minimize that with two opponents as such, and that would be that on the successors and the each opponents, and so it's just a very, very difficult situation that we need to avoid from being buried in that.
Dr. Hecker, you've heard me say this before, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to mention it. When I picked up your book, I had planned to read 100 pages or so in different seatings, and I couldn't put it down, and read it in one snowy afternoon here in Santa Fe. It is a remarkable book that looks at the diplomacy, the politics of our relations and negotiations with North Korea over a considerable period of time. There's a chapter or two that was pretty challenging for someone with a master's in international affairs, but I learned a lot. So I do want to encourage people to pick up the book and also go to the website called nonproliferation.org, and there's a link to Hinge Points. I had a chance to look at that over the last few days, and remarkable photos of your visits there, as well as some really valuable insights and notes and letters and memos that you wrote subsequent to your trip. So it's a great historical record. So thank you for writing the book and for providing all the annotations. We have a question here from Panal, who says, why do you feel North Korea won't talk to us now?
Yeah, we've been worried about that, and we've tracked it all along from essentially the changeover in administration, on the American side, when President Biden came in, the North Koreans were just sort of holding back to see what the Biden administration would do. And then they've never closed up rank. Of course, this was also, during the whole time of the pandemic. And so somewhere around 2021 going into 2022 is when I think the North Koreans made this change, that instead of seeking accommodation with the United States, they would look much more towards accommodation with Russia and with China. And then in that process, they just decided they need not talk to the Americans. And in fact, if you follow the language of what Kim Jongun and what all of Pyongyang has said vis-a-vis the situation in the Ukraine, I mean, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, he's given the Russians just sort of unconditional backing and has not answered the phone, so to say, with the United States. And so nothing has been discussed that we can tell in any serious vein between the United States and North Korea. So they essentially have cut us off.
And Ray asked this question as he makes his invaluable statement. Considering what has happened to the Ukraine, as well as Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, why does the United States think that North Korea would ever agree to give up its nuclear weapons?
Yeah, and so today, I mean, the money is on the fact that they won't give up the nuclear weapons. And indeed, the way they've sort of brandished those weapons and what they tell us almost every day of the new kinds of weapons and so forth that they've developed, it certainly doesn't look that they are interested. On the other hand, if you look back, over the just about 30 years where we believe they were seriously interested in working with the United States and coming towards normalization, that was a very, very different picture. They had hopes, in the end, they don't really want to be that close to the Chinese. I mean, to them, the Chinese were still the eternal enemy. The Russians were pretty good friends for a while, but Yeltsin tossed them out. And today they're sort of coming back together. So in the end, for those 30 years, the Ukrainians were much more looking towards the Americans for salvation. They were interested in economic development, and they just in the end, it didn't happen. And so now they've gone in the other direction.
So I wonder how North Korea looks at this developing special relationship between Russia and China. I wonder if they see that as a threat. Are they better off working individually with Russia and China, or now that there's this greater collaboration? I wonder how they look at it.
So I think what you mean individually with Russia and China, or with them together,
Yes.
It's much more working with them individually. As you look back in their history, the histories have been very individualistic with Russia and China. So I think they're working those individually. The one with Russia sort of comes to the fore more often now because of North Korea's support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the Chinese angle is there also. So I don't think it's a matter of the three of them working closely together, but certainly Pyongyang is working with both of them.
So Randy wants to know, during your trips, did you have a chance to meet with, as he says, everyday people in North Korea, or were you pretty much monitored by your minders?
Yeah, we were monitored by the minders essentially all the time. We did once go to a restaurant. We were allowed to without the minders with one of the UN people who was stationed there, who also happened to be from Dallas, Texas. But the rest of the time, we were always with minders. And yet, so even with that, though, we still learned a lot. And we had some fascinating exchanges, actually with the minders, and then with some of the people that we would visit. We went out to the communes and visited people in their homes, for example. But those were all set up. We went to the museums, and those were all set up by the North Koreans. So those North Koreans were totally different than what I did in Russia. I've been in Russia over 50 times and had totally different relationships with both the people and the technical folks. And I've been in China over 30 times similarly. So it was never like that in North Korea, much more controlled by the government. Nevertheless, still some very important insights.
I can't help but ask, how are your relations with Russians now? Are you able to continue to communicate with those you've known over the past many years?
So that's very interesting. With Russia's invasion of Crimea, going back, like almost 10 years now, our formal relationships were cut because our relationships were with their nuclear weapons experts. And so we've stayed in touch through email and mechanisms like that. To some extent, particularly the Russian scientists are the more direct they tend to be. And the more they look towards future collaborations and find it a pity that we let go what we worked so hard. And what we worked so hard for is that the disaster that was about to happen as the Soviet Union dissolved into Russia never happened. And it didn't happen to a large extent because of the Russian nuclear folks, the relations they had with us for all those years. So those are now much weaker, but they're still there. So we still communicate. Some of their communications are surprising as far as they're willing to step out. But the older they get, the more they're willing to step away, from the government line.
How do you see this repositioning or discussion of repositioning of nuclear weapons to Belarus?
It's just a terrible idea, just terrible. This is they already have those weapons that close by, on the Russian side. This is just strictly to put pressure on the US and on NATO. It's a dumb, terrible idea. They think, though, the more upset, we in the West tend to be, the more effective they are.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like we are almost out of time. And before I flip it over to Megan, let me just ask this last question, if you're able to respond. Another question from Dallas, Texas. I have read that the U.S. does not have in place a comprehensive set of missile defense systems capable of defending the homeland from severe missile threats such as North Korea's. What can you tell us about where we are on our own defense?
Yeah, so that's true. We've never gone fully in the direction of missile defense to defend the entire country. We can defend certain places, but we can't defend the entire country. And so if we're attacked by the Soviet Union in the past and Russia now, that will be significant damage. For North Korea, we can try to shoot some of their missiles down, but we're not in good shape as far as that is concerned with defensive systems.
Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Hecker. This has been such an insightful conversation, and I know we're just scratching the surface. I want to point out that in the chat, we have the link to nonproliferation.org, where you can find out more. And you can get Dr. Hecker's book, because I know that's just is just the beginning and we all want to dive deep. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you to the audience. I want to encourage everybody to support, go out, join your local World Affairs Councils, where you'll get more conversations like this. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.